The courtroom fell silent as the translation devices finished converting the verdict into dozens of alien languages. Thomas Reed sat perfectly still in the defendant's chair, his hands folded calmly in his lap, while the massive holographic display showed images of Scorian 7 rotating slowly above the assembled delegates. "The human will be transported immediately," announced High Arbiter Vorthak, his scaled face showing what Thomas had learned to recognize as satisfaction among the Draknari. The reptilian creature's yellow eyes gleamed as he continued. "Let this serve as a lesson to all species who think they can challenge the established order of the galaxy." Thomas had expected this outcome. 3 months ago, his engineering team on the mining station Kepler 9 had discovered that the Galactic Council had been deliberately sabotaging human colonies by providing faulty atmospheric processors. When he presented the evidence, they accused him of theft and espionage instead of addressing the corruption. The trial had been a show from the beginning. The crystalline resonant delegate, Sub-Arbiter Kylos, spoke through harmonic frequencies that the translators converted into mechanical words. "The desert world has claimed 17 different species over 3,000 years. The human will learn that his kind's arrogance has limits." Around the curved amphitheater, representatives from 47 different species watched with varying degrees of interest. Most seemed bored. Humans were still newcomers to galactic politics, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago. To these ancient civilizations, humanity was barely worth noticing. "Do you have any final words before transport?" Vorthak asked, clearly expecting some desperate plea for mercy. Thomas stood up slowly. He was average height for a human, but small compared to most of the delegates surrounding him. His brown hair was getting gray at the temples, and his hands showed the calluses of someone who had spent years working with tools and machinery. At 52, he had seen enough of the galaxy to know that this moment would define not just his future, but possibly humanity's place among the stars. "I want to thank the Council," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. "You're giving me exactly what I need." The confused murmur that ran through the delegates made Thomas smile. He had studied the records of Scorian 7 during his 3 days in detention. Every species that had attempted to colonize the desert world had approached it the same way. They brought massive terraforming equipment, climate control systems, and enough supplies to build cities. They all failed within 2 years. But Thomas had noticed something in the geological surveys that apparently no one else had bothered to examine closely. The mineral composition told a story that went far deeper than the empty surface. The transport ship that carried Thomas to Scorian 7 was automated and efficient. The crew consisted of 2 Draknari guards who spent the 3-day journey making jokes about how long he would survive. They gave him the basic survival kit required by galactic law: water purification tablets for 30 days, emergency rations for the same period, a beacon to call for rescue, basic tools, and a shelter pod, rated for extreme temperatures. "The supply drops come every 6 months, one of the guards explained as they prepared for orbital insertion. "Assuming you live that long, most species activate the emergency beacon within the first week." The descent through Scorian 7's thin atmosphere was rough. The automated lander touched down during the planet's day cycle when surface temperatures reached nearly 60 degrees Celsius. Through the small porthole, Thomas could see endless dunes of red sand stretching to the horizon under a pale orange sky. The guards activated the lander's external speakers to talk to him during the final moments before they released him. "The night temperatures dropped to 20 below zero," the senior guard said. "The sandstorms can last for weeks. The radiation from the binary suns will cook you if you stay exposed too long. Even the Council didn't think humans were stupid enough to actually try surviving here." Thomas gathered his supplies and checked the seals on his basic environmental suit. The kit included a simple shelter that could maintain breathable atmosphere and reasonable temperature, but only for about 48 hours on its power cells. After that, he would need to find his own solutions. The landing pad retracted. dropping him onto the burning sand. The ship lifted off immediately, its engines scattering more sand in every direction. Within minutes, it was just a bright spot climbing toward the stars, leaving Thomas alone on a world that had killed thousands of beings far more advanced than humans. He stood there for several minutes, feeling the heat radiating up through his boots and watching the empty landscape around him. The silence was complete except for the whisper of wind moving sand across the dunes. In the distance, he could see the dark shapes of what looked like rock formations. Most castaways would have immediately deployed their shelter and begun rationing their water. Thomas did something different. He activated his suit's recording function and began walking toward the rocks, pulling his supplies behind him on the small anti-grav sled that came with the kit. Day 1 on Skorion 7, he said to the recorder. Surface temperature is 58 Celsius, air pressure is 0.7 standard, oxygen content is negligible. But the interesting thing is what I'm not seeing. He stopped and knelt down, scooping up a handful of the red sand. Through his suit's gloves, he could feel that it wasn't actually sand at all, but tiny fragments of crystallized minerals. This isn't a desert, he continued, letting the particles run through his fingers. This is the top layer of something. Much bigger. The geological surveys showed trace elements that don't match surface formation. There's something underneath all this, and I'm going to find it. The rock formations turned out to be the remains of previous colonization attempts. Twisted metal and shattered crystal structures poked up through the dunes like grave markers. Thomas examined several sites, noting that each group had tried to build above ground, fighting the desert instead of understanding it. As the sun began to set and the temperature started dropping, Thomas finally deployed his shelter near the largest ruin. But instead of settling in for the night, he began sorting through the debris, looking for anything useful. By the light of his suit's headlamp, he started his first engineering project on Skorion 7. He was going to prove that humans could succeed, where everyone else had failed, not by conquering the desert, but by learning its secrets. Dawn brought a light that felt different from any sun Thomas had known. The binary star system cast 2 shadows from every object, creating a landscape of strange geometries and shifting patterns. He had been awake for 2 hours already, working, by the glow of his suit's systems, to modify salvaged equipment from the alien ruins. The night had been productive. Using metal scraps from a failed hegemony colony, Thomas had built his first tool, a simple seismic detector made from a pressure sensor and a piece of resonant crystal he had found in the debris. It wasn't sophisticated, but it would tell him if there was anything hollow beneath the surface. His water supplies were already running lower than they should have been, but Thomas wasn't worried. During the night, he had noticed something that apparently every previous colonist had missed. The temperature differential between day and night created condensation patterns on certain types of rock. Not much, but enough to collect if you knew where to look. Day 2, he recorded as he packed up his makeshift camp. I'm moving to higher ground to get a better view of the terrain patterns. The orbital surveys all focused on surface composition, but they missed the important details. The climb up the rocky ridge took most of the morning. The heat was brutal, but Thomas had learned to pace himself, moving steadily without wasting energy. At the top, he deployed his improvised seismic detector and began the tedious work of mapping underground formations. What he found made him laugh, out loud for the first time since his trial. The readings showed a massive void system running beneath the desert floor. Not just empty spaces, but organized patterns that suggested natural tunnel networks carved by water flow over millions of years. Every previous colonist had been trying to build on top of a hidden river system. "You magnificent bastards," he said to the empty air, thinking about all the alien engineers who had died here. "You brought everything you needed except the one thing that matters most: curiosity." Thomas spent the next week mapping the underground formations. His improvised tools were crude, but they worked. He created a gravity detector using scavenged components and metal weights, a basic magnetometer from wire coils and salvaged power cells, and even a simple ground-penetrating device by modifying an emergency beacon. The picture that emerged was extraordinary. Beneath Scorian 7's dead surface lay a network of caverns and waterways that stretched across continents. Ancient geological processes had carved out an entire hidden world, complete with multiple levels and connecting passages. The reason, no. One had found it was simple. All previous expeditions had been looking for signs of surface water or trying to import their own. On day 10, Thomas made his most important discovery. In a small depression between two dunes, his seismic readings showed water moving less than 15 meters below the surface, not just standing water, but flow patterns that indicated a significant underground stream. He began digging immediately. The work was backbreaking. The desert heat made every hour of labor feel like running a marathon, and the sand kept sliding back into his excavation. But Thomas had learned patience during his years as a mining engineer. He worked in the early morning and late evening, when temperatures were manageable, and spent the brutal midday hours under his shelter, planning his next moves. His supplies were running dangerously low, but Thomas felt more hopeful than he had since leaving Earth. Every shovelful of sand brought him closer to proving that human ingenuity could succeed where alien technology had failed. On day 15, his improvised drill bit finally broke through into empty space. The sound was unmistakable, the hollow echo of a significant cavity below ground. Thomas enlarged the hole carefully, using techniques he had learned in asteroid mining to prevent cave-ins. When he finally lowered a light into the opening, what he saw took his breath away. The cavern below was huge, stretching beyond the range of his light beam. The walls were smooth stone carved by water over geological timescales, and running through the center of the space was exactly what he had hoped to find: a clear stream of flowing water, moving steadily through the darkness towards some distant destination. But there was something even more amazing. The water glowed, not with artificial light, but with the soft blue-green phosphorescence of living organisms. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Thomas could see that the entire underground ecosystem was alive with bioluminescent creatures that had evolved in the cavern system over millions of years. Day 15, he recorded, his voice tight with excitement. I found it. Not just water, but a complete biosphere. This isn't a dead world. It's a world that's been hiding. That night, Thomas rappelled down into the cavern using rope made from strips of his emergency shelter. The temperature below ground was perfect for human comfort, maintained by geothermal processes and insulated by the thick layer of sand above. The air was breathable, with oxygen produced by the underground. Plant life. He spent hours exploring the immediate area, mapping passages and testing water samples. Everything checked out. The water was pure, the air was clean, and the ecosystem was stable. Thomas had found not just survival, but the foundation for an entire civilization. Above ground, his emergency beacon sat silent in his abandoned camp. According to the Council's predictions, he should have activated it days ago. Instead, Thomas was planning something that no exile in galactic history had ever attempted. He was going to build a city. The next morning, Thomas began the careful work of expanding his access to the underground system. Using salvaged materials and improvised tools, he constructed a permanent entrance that could be concealed from orbital observation. He built water-lifting devices, air circulation systems, and even a basic workshop using the natural acoustics of the cavern. Each day brought new discoveries. The underground river system was vast, with multiple levels and countless branches. The bioluminescent organisms weren't just providing light. They were part of a complex food web that had been thriving in isolation for millions of years. Thomas began to understand that Scorian 7 wasn't a failed world at all. It was a successful world that had simply chosen to hide its success beneath the surface. 3 weeks after his exile began, Thomas had achieved what the Galactic Council thought was impossible. He had not only survived on Scorian 7, but he had found the key to making the desert world into something greater than any of the council members had ever imagined. Standing waist-deep in the glowing underground stream, Thomas raised his recorder one more time. Day 21. I'm officially declaring Scorian 7 to be habitable, not just for survival, but for permanent colonization, and I'm going to prove it. Thomas had been underground for 6 days straight, and he was starting to understand why the bioluminescent organisms had evolved the way they did. The ecosystem below Scorian 7 was more complex than anything in the xenobiology textbooks. The glowing creatures weren't just providing light. They were maintaining perfect chemical balance in the water, processing nutrients, and even generating small amounts of electrical current through their metabolic processes. He had built his first permanent workshop in a large chamber about 50 meters downstream from his original entry point. Using salvaged metal and natural rock formations, Thomas created workbenches, tool storage, and even a basic forge powered by concentrated solar energy channeled down through a carefully angled mirror system. Day 27, he recorded while adjusting the flow rate on his improvised water wheel. The underground river system is revealing its secrets. The flow rate is constant year-round, maintained by thermal processes deep in the planet's core. The water temperature never varies more than 2 degrees, and the mineral content is perfect for human consumption. What excited him most was the engineering potential. The river system wasn't just one stream, but a network of dozens of waterways, at different levels, all connected by natural passages that could be modified and expanded. Thomas had found evidence of at least 5 major levels, each with its own characteristics and possibilities. The real breakthrough came when he discovered that the bioluminescent organisms responded to human presence. Not intelligence exactly, but a kind of biological programming that made them brighter when he was working and dimmer when he rested. It was as if the ecosystem was adapting to include him as part of its natural cycle. Thomas began his most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive mapping expedition through the cavern system. Using rope, marking stakes, and his collection of improvised instruments, he started what would become the first complete survey of Scorian 7's hidden world. The first major chamber he explored was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared beyond. His light range and walls covered in mineral formations that looked like frozen waterfalls. The river here split into 3 separate streams, each flowing toward different parts of the underground network. Thomas named it Central Hub and began planning how it could serve as the heart of a future city. The second chamber was smaller but more interesting. The walls here were lined with natural crystal formations that amplified sound and light. When Thomas spoke, his voice echoed with perfect clarity, and when he held up his light, the crystals reflected it throughout the entire space. He realized he had found a natural communication center that could connect different parts of the underground system. But it was the third chamber that changed everything. Thomas had been following the largest of the river branches for most of a day when he noticed that the water flow was increasing. The stream was being fed by additional sources, and the sound of moving water was getting louder. When he finally reached the source, he stood staring at something that took several minutes to fully understand. He was looking at an underground waterfall. The water cascaded down from somewhere high above, falling through a vertical shaft that rose beyond the range of his lights. The spray created a constant mist that kept the air humid and fresh, and the force of the falling water generated enough kinetic energy to power significant machinery. Thomas spent 2 days exploring the waterfall chamber. The vertical shaft, he discovered, rose almost to the surface level. With some careful engineering, it could provide a secondary access point that would be completely invisible from above ground. More importantly, the falling water could power generators, pumps, and industrial equipment. Day 32, he recorded while sketching plans for a hydroelectric system. I've found the power source for a complete underground civilization. The waterfall chamber could support manufacturing, food production, and even climate control systems for the entire network. Using his growing collection of tools, Thomas began construction of his first major engineering project. The hydroelectric generator was built from salvaged components, scavenged wire, and natural materials. The turbine blades were carved from lightweight metal panels. The generator housing was fashioned from a piece of alien equipment he had found in the ruins, and the power transmission system used copper wire stripped from various sources. It took him a week to build, test, and install the system. When he finally activated it, the results exceeded his expectations. The generator produced enough electricity to power lighting throughout the main chambers, run pumps for water distribution, and operate the workshop equipment he had been building. With reliable power, Thomas expanded his operations rapidly. He built a proper water treatment system, established food production areas using edible varieties of the underground plants, and created communication networks using the natural acoustics of the crystal chamber. Within a month of finding the waterfall, he had the foundation of a functioning town. The most important development was his discovery that the underground ecosystem could be enhanced without destroying it. By carefully introducing earth plant seeds he had brought in his survival kit, Thomas found that certain food crops could grow in the cavern system alongside the native organisms. The bioluminescent creatures seemed to actually help the earth. Plants grow better, creating hybrid growing systems that were more productive than either species alone. Thomas began documenting everything. His daily recordings now included detailed technical specifications, engineering drawings, and biological observations. He was creating a complete manual for underground colonization, though he had no way to share it yet. Day 51, he recorded, while standing in the main chamber, now lit by his electric system and dotted with growing food plots. The hidden river isn't just sustaining me. It's allowing me to build something that could support thousands of people. This isn't survival anymore. This is colonization. The supply drop from orbit was scheduled to arrive in 2 more weeks, but Thomas no longer needed it. His food production was meeting his nutritional requirements, his water supply was unlimited, and his power systems were operating efficiently. He had achieved complete self-sufficiency using only the resources that Scorion 7 had been hiding all along. Standing at the edge of the underground waterfall, listening to the constant sound of falling water, and watching the play of light on the cavern walls, Thomas made a decision that would change galactic history. He wasn't just going to survive his exile. He was going to turn Scorion 7 into proof that human engineering could succeed where alien technology had failed. The Council had sent him here to die as an example. Instead, he was going to make this world into an example of something much more important. What happened when humans refused to accept that something was impossible? Day 53. I'm ready to begin Phase 2 of the project. It's time to bring the hidden river to the surface. The scheduled supply drop arrived exactly on time, the automated cargo pod touching down near Thomas's original landing site. From his hidden observation post on the ridge, Thomas watched the orbital delivery with amusement. The supply containers held standard survival rations, water purification equipment, and basic tools. Everything he had needed 3 months ago, and nothing he needed now. He collected the supplies anyway, partly because they contained useful materials, but mostly because he wanted the Council to think he was still dependent on their charity. The orbital monitors would detect the pod's activation and assume their castaway was barely surviving on scheduled deliveries. Thomas had spent the past month expanding his underground civilization in ways that would have seemed impossible when he first arrived. The main chamber complex now included residential areas, workshops, food production facilities, and even recreational spaces carved from natural cave formations. His engineering had grown sophisticated enough to include climate control, waste processing, and manufacturing capabilities. The breakthrough that made it all possible was his discovery of how to work with the planet's hidden ecosystem instead of fighting against it. The bioluminescent organisms weren't just providing light. They were part of a biological manufacturing system that could process raw materials, purify air and water, and even produce certain types of organic compounds that Thomas needed for his engineering projects. Day 97, he recorded while inspecting his latest creation, a communications array built into the crystal chamber. I've established contact with the underground network on 3 different continents. The river system is global. What I've built here is just the beginning. The global discovery had been accidental. While testing his hydroelectric generator at different power levels, Thomas had noticed that the electrical current in the water created resonance patterns in the mineral formations throughout the cave system. By modulating the frequency, he found he could send signals through the underground network across vast distances. The responses he received proved that Scorian 7's hidden biosphere was much larger than he had imagined. The planet wasn't a dead world with a small underground ecosystem. It was a living world that had simply moved below ground to avoid the harsh surface conditions. The entire planet was riddled with cavern systems, underground rivers, and thriving biological communities. Thomas began planning something unprecedented, a complete planetary colonization system based entirely on underground development. Using the existing cave networks as a foundation, he could build cities that would be invisible from space but capable of supporting millions of inhabitants. His manufacturing capabilities had grown to include metal fabrication, electronics production, and even primitive chemical processing. The key was learning to combine human engineering with the planet's natural biological systems. The underground organisms could be directed to help with construction projects, while human technology provided power, transportation, and communication networks. The residential section of Thomas's colony now included comfortable living spaces, a library area where he stored his technical documentation, and workshop areas specialized for different types of manufacturing. He had built furniture from shaped stone and metal, created art using the natural phosphorescence of the cave walls, and even established a small garden where earth vegetables grew alongside alien plant species. But the most important development was his transportation network. Thomas had discovered that many of the underground rivers were navigable by small boats. Using salvaged materials and local resources, he built a fleet of vessels that allowed him to explore and connect different parts of the cavern system. Within a few weeks, he had established supply routes, communication links, and even regular travel schedules between major underground locations. Day 112, he recorded while standing on the deck of his latest boat, a sleek vessel, powered by a combination of water flow and electric motors. I've connected 17 major chamber complexes across 400 kilometers. The underground transportation network is more efficient than most planetary surface systems. The farming developments were equally impressive. Thomas had discovered that certain Earth crops not only grew well in the underground environment, but actually improved the soil chemistry for native species. By creating mixed agricultural systems, he was able to produce food surplus, while enhancing the natural ecosystem. His communication with the orbital monitoring station was carefully managed. Every few days, Thomas would return to the surface and activate his emergency beacon just long enough to transmit basic survival reports. The messages were designed to sound increasingly desperate and isolated, while actually documenting his growing success in coded technical language that the alien monitors wouldn't recognize. The power generation system had evolved into something that would have impressed engineers anywhere in the galaxy. Thomas had built a network of hydroelectric stations, geothermal taps, and even experimental systems that harvested energy from the biological processes of the underground organisms. His power grid now supplied reliable electricity to facilities, spread across hundreds of kilometers of cavern systems. The manufacturing facilities were producing everything from basic tools to sophisticated electronic equipment. Thomas had reverse-engineered the alien technology from the surface ruins and improved on many of the designs using human engineering principles and local materials. His workshops could now produce components for expansion projects, research, equipment, and even luxury items that made underground life comfortable and pleasant. Day 128, he recorded from his newest facility, a research laboratory built in a cavern that provided perfect temperature and humidity control. I've documented 47 different species of underground organisms, mapped over 3,000 kilometers of river networks, and established permanent infrastructure that could support a population of 50,000 people. The most significant achievement was his development of surface connection systems. Thomas had built carefully concealed access points that allowed movement between the underground cities and selected surface locations. These connections were camouflaged so perfectly that orbital observation couldn't detect them, but they provided air circulation, solar power collection, and even limited surface agriculture in protected areas. Standing in his command center, surrounded by displays showing power levels, water flow rates, communication traffic, and agricultural production statistics, Thomas realized he had accomplished something that no galactic civilization had ever achieved. He had built a thriving planetary colony using only local resources and human ingenuity. The scheduled orbital supply drop was due again in 2 weeks, but Thomas had already decided this would be the last one he would accept. His colony was completely self-sufficient and growing rapidly. It was time to stop pretending to be a desperate castaway and start demonstrating what humans could accomplish when they refused to accept defeat. Day 135. Final preparation phase is complete. Tomorrow, I begin surface operations. It's time to show the galaxy what the human approach can accomplish. It's time to make the desert bloom. Thomas stood at the edge of what had been empty desert 6 months ago, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and orange. Around him stretched a landscape that would have been impossible to imagine when he first arrived on Scorian 7. Green patches dotted the red sand dunes like emeralds scattered across copper, and the air carried scents of growing plants and flowing water. The transformation had begun quietly 3 weeks ago. Thomas had spent months preparing the surface irrigation system, carefully placing underground pipes and pumps that connected to his hidden river network. When he finally activated the system, water began flowing to precisely calculated locations, across hundreds of square kilometers of desert. But water alone wouldn't have been enough. The real key was the soil treatment system Thomas had developed using the bioluminescent organisms from the underground ecosystem. These creatures, when exposed to surface conditions in controlled amounts, created a biological soil enhancement that transformed sterile sand into fertile growing medium within days. Day 158. Thomas recorded as he walked through his newest garden area. Surface agriculture is exceeding all projections. The combination of underground water systems, biological soil enhancement, and earth plant species adapted for desert conditions is creating sustainable oasis environments. The orbital monitoring station had taken notice. For the past week, Thomas had detected increased scanning activity from the Council ships stationed above the planet. They knew something unusual was happening on the surface, but their instruments couldn't identify the source of the changes. Thomas had been careful to make the transformation look natural. The green patches appeared gradually, following patterns that mimicked natural water springs and seasonal growth cycles. From orbit, it would look like Scorian 7 was experiencing some kind of environmental shift, not like an exiled human was terraforming the planet from below. The agricultural systems were just the visible part of Thomas's final project. Below ground, he had completed construction of a full planetary infrastructure that could support a major colonial population. The underground cities now included manufacturing districts, research facilities, transportation hubs, and residential areas that would have impressed architects anywhere in the galaxy. His communication network had grown sophisticated enough to maintain real-time contact with underground facilities across 3 continents. The power grid supplied clean energy to hundreds of locations. The water management system maintained perfect flow rates throughout thousands of kilometers of rivers and irrigation channels. Thomas had built the foundation for a civilization that could thrive on Scorian 7 for thousands of years. But the most important development was his documentation system. Every technical specification, every biological observation, every engineering Solution was being broadcast continuously on an open galactic communication channel. Thomas had been sharing his methods with struggling colonies throughout the galaxy, teaching them how to find and develop the hidden resources that existed on thousands of worlds the Council had written off as uninhabitable. The response had been overwhelming. Desert worlds, ice planets, toxic atmosphere systems, and resource-poor colonies were all reporting success using Thomas's techniques. The human approach of working with existing ecosystems instead of replacing them was spreading across the galaxy, faster than the Council could track. Day 165. Thomas recorded from his surface observatory, a comfortable structure built into a hillside and camouflaged to look like natural rock formations. I've received confirmation from 47 different worlds that my methods are working. Colonies that were on the verge of failure are now thriving. The galactic paradigm for planetary development is changing. The orbital station's scanning had become more intensive. Thomas knew that a landing party would arrive soon to investigate the surface changes. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, setting up demonstration areas that would show visiting council members exactly how much they had underestimated both Scorian 7 and human capabilities. The landing came at midday when the desert heat was at its peak. Thomas watched through his observation equipment as a council shuttlecraft descended toward his original landing site. The crew was led by High Arbiter Vorthak himself, along with several technical specialists and military escorts. Thomas met them at the edge of his largest oasis, a 10-hectare area where earth vegetables grew alongside alien desert plants, all watered by a system of streams that emerged from carefully hidden underground sources. He was wearing practical work clothes and carrying a basket of fresh produce when the council delegation approached. "High Arbiter," Thomas said pleasantly, offering Vorthak a piece of fruit. "Welcome to Scorian 7. I hope you don't mind, but I've made a few improvements since I arrived." The silence that followed was worth 6 months of exile. Vorthak and his team stood staring at the impossible sight of thriving agriculture in what should have been sterile desert. Their scanning equipment was reading massive underground infrastructure, flowing water systems, and power generation on a scale that rivaled major colonial installations. "This is not possible," Sub-Arbiter Kylos finally managed to say through the translation system. "Our geological surveys confirmed that this world has no water resources, no viable soil, and no sustainable ecosystem." Thomas smiled and gestured toward the streams flowing through his garden areas. "Your surveys were looking in the wrong places. This planet has more fresh water than most core worlds, more available energy than industrial systems, and one of the most stable ecosystems I've ever studied. You just have to know where to look." He led the delegation on a tour that revealed the scope of what he had accomplished. The surface installations were impressive, but when Thomas opened a concealed entrance and took them underground, the council delegates found themselves in a world that redefined their understanding of planetary development. The main cavern complex stretched beyond the range of their lights, illuminated by living organisms and powered by renewable energy systems. Transportation networks connected to distant chambers. Manufacturing facilities produced everything from basic tools to sophisticated electronics. Agricultural areas grew food for thousands of potential colonists. "How?" was all Vorthak could manage to say. "The same way humans have always solved problems," Thomas replied. "We looked at what was already here, figured out how it worked, and found ways to work with it instead of against it. Every species that tried to colonize this world brought their own solutions. I used the solutions the planet had already developed." In the crystal communication chamber, Thomas demonstrated his galactic broadcast system. Dozens of worlds were checking in with progress reports on their own development projects using his methods. Desert worlds were blooming. Ice planets were finding thermal resources, and toxic atmosphere systems were discovering underground biospheres. "You've been sharing this information?" Kylos asked. "Of course," Thomas said. "Why would I keep it secret? There are thousands of worlds out there that could support thriving colonies if people just knew how to look for the resources that are already there. The delegation spent 3 days touring Thomas's installations and reviewing his technical documentation. What they found was a complete planetary development system that could be adapted to almost any world, using only local resources and sustainable engineering practices. On their final day, High Arbiter Vorthak asked the question Thomas had been expecting. "What do you want in return for this knowledge?" Thomas looked around at the underground city he had built, then up at the concealed entrance that led to his blooming desert above. "I want you to understand something about humans. You sent me here thinking the desert would defeat me. Instead, I learned to hear what the desert was trying to tell me. That's what humans do. We listen to what others think is impossible, and we find ways to make it work." He activated his communication system one final time, broadcasting to the thousands of colonies across the galaxy that were now using his methods. The galaxy is full of worlds that seem impossible to colonize, but they're only impossible if you approach them the wrong way. Every planet has resources. Every ecosystem has solutions. You just have to be willing to learn instead of assuming you already know the answers. Standing in the garden that had grown where once there was only empty sand, Thomas watched the council shuttle prepare for departure. They were taking copies of all his technical documentation and samples of the biological systems he had developed. More importantly, they were taking proof that human engineering could succeed where alien technology had failed. The desert that was supposed to defeat him had become a river of life flowing across the galaxy, carrying hope to colonies that had been written off as failures. Thomas had done more than survive his exile. He had turned punishment into victory and shown the galaxy a new way to approach the impossible.